I'm Christopher Coates, Editor-at-Large of Whisky magazine. Today we're heading to the Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh to meet one of the whisky industry's most revered master blenders, Maureen Robinson. With a career spanning over 45 years, encompassing lab work, new spirit assessment and blending for Diageo's portfolio of distilleries, Maureen has worked on some of the world's most well-known Scotch whisky brands and a number of much-loved and now quite sought-after single malt collections. Honoured as a Master of the Quaich and inducted as a member of the Whisky magazine's illustrious Hall of Fame in 2019, Maureen has witnessed the meteoric rise of Scotland's national spirit firsthand. Although she officially retired in June 2022, Maureen hasn't put down her nose in glass for good just yet. In early 2023, the fan favourite bourbon brand Kentucky Owl invited Maureen to try her hand at blending her first Kentucky bourbon, the Kentucky Owl Maighstir Edition. The latest in a series of collaborations between Kentucky Owl's master blender John Rhea and contemporaries from around the world, Maureen has been tasked with channeling the unique style and traditions of Scotch whisky to see if it's possible to create an homage to the robust and fruity style of single malt Scotch whisky using America's native spirit. But to truly understand and appreciate Maureen's unique take on Kentucky bourbon, we first need to understand her myriad influences and extensive experience. So, Maureen, you've had an absolutely incredible 45-year career in the whisky industry, and something that I love to ask people when I get a chance to turn their ear for a moment for a chat is, how did you get into the whisky business?
I suppose you could say it was by accident. I actually started to train to become a pharmacist, but I then decided to take a sabbatical for a year, and within that year I decided to go and join the Scotch whisky industry. In the early days I worked in the laboratories for 9 of the 45 years, then I moved into blending, and to me that was just a complete change of what I'd been doing.
So how did you feel when you were approached by Kentucky Owl to work on this special project?
It was one of these things that came out of the blue. You know, somebody asked, would I be interested in doing that? And I thought, yeah, I would be, because it's something I've never done before. I retired at the end of June in 2022, but I still want to be involved. I still want to keep being able to nose, taste different things, and thought this would be an interesting project to get involved in. This is another development curve for me because I'd never done it before, and I was really looking forward to working with John Rhea, the master blender, the Kentucky Owl master blender. And I have been asked before, trying to make a Scotch taste like a bourbon, but this was the opposite. This was me trying to get a bourbon to taste like a Scotch.
So seeing as you'd never worked on a Kentucky bourbon before, or indeed any kind of bourbon before, did you have some preconceptions about the style before you were sent the samples?
Yes, I had a preconception of bourbon because my experience in the past was it was very oaky and woody, and there was lots of sweetness and vanilla fudge there, and also what I term as black currants. I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised when I received the samples that how close some of the flavours and aromas and flavours that were coming through were close to Scotch whisky.
How did you begin approaching this, the creation of this special blend for Kentucky Owl?
Yeah. Well, I was given actually 4 what term as building blocks by the Kentucky Owl master blender John Rhea. What he's gave me was 3 straight bourbons, a 5 to 6-year-old, 8 to 9-year-old, and a 9 to 10-year-old, and also a wheat bourbon, which was 4 to 5-year-old. So there was 4 blends he made up, and he actually gave me the recipe for these blends for me to make them up myself fresh. Rather than sending me the blends, and what he asked me to do then was, once I've nosed and tasted them, pick the one I thought was the closest to me as a Scotch whisky, and then start using these 4 building blocks. Did I want to tweak the whisky? Did I feel it needed a wee bit of adjustment? Which I did, because when doing the process, I ended up also doing 4 different blends. So basically we were in the same wavelength. The wheat bourbon is 4 to 5-year-old, but it's got like nice citrus notes and things like that. It's probably the least bourbon-like of the 4 of them. but you still have the sort of slight oakiness of a bourbon. And then the 5 to 6-year-old one, again, to me, that's more like fresh fruits and a little bit more oaky, but you also had the sort of black currants coming through that you would get with a bourbon. And then the 8 to 9-year-old, again, that was what I tell more, it's fruity, but there's a lot of sweetness there. It's almost like stewed fruits. You know how if you're cooking an apple tart or whatever, you've got the stewed fruit coming through. But again, that was very, you start to get lots more flavour coming through the bourbon type attributes like the oakiness, the sweetness and vanilla and the black currants. To me, the final building block, which was the 9 to 10-year-old, to me that was the one that was the closest to my preconception of bourbon. It was really quite oaky and woody and lots of sort of black currants and vanilla sweetness.
And what did you find? One of the components that you were given was a wheated bourbon. How did you find that differed from the other samples that you had?
To me, the wheat bourbon had a lighter style, and it was more, you get the citrus fruits was coming through, so they were it was a lighter style than the other three. And so to me, all 4 of them complemented one another, and it did give you, it gave you 4 tools to work with, one, to create something. The wheat bourbon was the one that was probably the one that was more towards a Scotch than the other 3.
So what we'll do is we'll start off by having a little nose of the 4 to 5-year-old sample. So I'd love to hear if this is how you remember this sample to be, and to get a bit more of an understanding about the role this plays in the blend.
Yeah, and this is the wheat bourbon, which, see, to me, that's got lots of the sort of citrus fruits coming through. So, for me, it's like mandarins. And just in the background, you get a wee hint of grass, but not much. But it is very reminiscent of a Scotch.
The next one up in terms of age range was a 5 to 6-year-old straight bourbon. So I'll pour you a little sample of this to have a nose of. And perhaps you can tell me exactly how this one behaved in the blend.
Now this one's a lot, it's not as citrusy on the nose, it's a bit more gentler on the nose. The wheat bourbon's a bit more prickly on the nose because it's lighter, fresher, whereas this one's a lot sweeter. And you've got this sort of, what I would term as sort of fresh fruits, which is almost like apples and pears. You've got that kind of fruit just come through. And again, it's got a bit more oak in it, which is very, which is to me sort of within the bourbon attributes.
And people often talk about how in blending you have sort of base malts, sort of like the middle malts, and then you might have top dressers. Yeah. How would you characterise these samples?
You probably take the sort of the wheat bourbon blend and then start building around that, because that's the one to me was more reminiscent of a Scotch. That's the one you want to have as your base, because then you want to sort of build round about that to create something, but still you're starting to build up the layers and levels of a bourbon into that. That's your Scotch base, and then you're starting building up the layers for the bourbon. And again, and this one actually, this is one of the ones where I got almost like, it's quite green, and it's almost like what I term as hedgerows. You know, how you get that green perfumed type of a hedgerow. I think actually one of my comments for this one was, not everybody would be familiar with this, is I actually said Parma violets, wee purple sweets, and they had this distinct floral perfumed aroma into that, and that was one of the comments I made on this, was it was Parma violets.
And then the next one up in terms of the age range was the 8 to 9-year-old.
And again, I found that was you were getting more of the sort of green notes were coming through as well.
Really? Well, I'll let you have a little taste of that. So that one's here.
Yeah, again, you do get the sort of sort of almost like stewed fruits coming through as well. You've got the sweetness of you normally get with bourbon, and just hints of the sort of black currants in the background. And again, you've got that oakiness, but it's not a woody oakiness. It's very subtle. You get kind of just a hint of citrus still in the background with this one as well.
And then the last component we've got here was the oldest whiskey in the blend, which is the 9 to 10-year-old sample.
Now, this is the one when I was doing this, I felt was the closest to, it was more bourbon traits and attributes than Scotch attributes. Yeah, it's very sort of, it's earthy. And then you've got the oak comes through. And again, you've got the sort of maybe hedgerows coming through again, but it's more the sort of earthy, oaky, is a wee bit more predominant than the actual perfumed floral side of it.
Famously, blenders will talk about the fact that sometimes 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2 with blending, and that sometimes whiskies behave in unexpected ways. Were there any of these whiskies that didn't quite behave the way you thought they would?
There was. It was actually the 9 to 10-year-old. It was one of these things where, I'd tried playing around with I made up 4 different blends, and one of them was where I actually reduced the quantity of the 9 to 10-year-old I put in, thinking, I think it was I upped the wheat bourbon, thinking, right, if I reduce that because it's got more of the sort of oaky, woody flavours and aromas and increase the sort of citrus flavours, it would give it more Scotch credentials. But it didn't. It was actually the complete opposite. It actually closed down the whisky. It actually didn't have much aroma about it. The flavour wasn't as good and things like that. And I must admit, it's not the first time I've seen this. And because in a Scotch, sometimes you find that smoky whisky. Sometimes when you're doing a blend, you need the smoky whisky to actually get the aromas to come through. Not so much the flavour, because smoky whisky is quite predominant on the palate once you taste the smoke. But from an aroma perspective, if you don't have smoke there, something it's just nothing. It's quite bland, and I felt this was similar to that, where so I went back to increasing the 9 to 10-year-old and played around again with the other 3 components to get what I thought was the best match for the Scotch.
So tell me, what was it like working with John Rhea? How did that collaboration play out?
Oh, to me, it worked really good. To begin with, we had lots, had conversations, well, in this day and age, Zoom conversations, and, just kind of understanding, his way of thinking and what the process was going, what he was going to do and things like that. And then he sort of made up the blends and sent the samples to me. And to a certain extent, that made my life a lot easier, because he'd already done a lot of the work with the building blocks, which in the past I would have been doing myself, like bringing in this cast samples, nosing them, mix them together. If it wasn't quite right, having to redo them and things like that. So he'd done all that part, and then he sent me the samples. And like what he did with me, where he sent me the building blocks and then I had to make the blends up fresh, he did the same when I sent him the recipe. I didn't actually send any samples open, I just sent the recipe to him, and he actually then made it up. Part of the process was that we blended the whisky and then we left it for 24 hours. When I was doing this, I initially nosed and tasted the samples because at 50%, because this product's going to be at 50% volume. So sort of blended them and let it settle. Then I nosed it at 24 hours. And then one of the other things that John did was he left it for another 24 hours. And we actually nosed it at reduced strength as well, because often just to make sure if anything was coming through, there wasn't any off notes of that coming through, because you always find when you're nosing, whether it's Scotch or bourbon, that when you add water at a diluted level, any off notes are going to come through at the diluted level, so that you've got what you want and you're not going to get any surprises once you add the water. then, once the consumer adds the water.
That's really interesting as well, because of course, in the world of Scotch whisky, there are a few producers who do similar kinds of things. I believe Gordon MacPhail are quite well known for marrying for quite extended periods of time. Historically, Macallan, I don't think they do it anymore, but historically they would even put blends back into cask to marry for extended periods of time.
Yeah, there is, as you say, there's lots of companies do that. Not everybody does. I know in the past when I've worked on Scotch, it's not necessarily been marrying what we term in the vat. We've maybe done marrying in the cask, and basically again there we've been trying to get to put it back into cask, and sometimes that cask would be a finishing cask, so it wasn't just the whisky itself. Sometimes you'd put it into marrying as well, just to let everything settle. And the old terminology, why we call it marrying, is it's almost like you talk about marriage. It's all about getting to know one another, and that's why you got the terminology of marrying.
Could you also tell me about whether you found there were some differences or similarities in the approach between yourself and John Rhea?
I think there's more similarities than there are differences. They sort of, a bit like me, if he was creating something new, he does it in his head first. You have it in your head and your mind based on your experience and what you've done in the past, and that's what John did. And the initial sort of screening he was doing he was reminiscent of what he remembered when he was nosing and tasting Scotch. And one of his comments, actually, when I was reading his notes, was that it took him back to being in a Scottish warehouse. Which I think was really showed that we'd actually achieved what we were wanting to do.
So using these four components, and then by sort of riffing on the recipes that John had proposed, you eventually settled on a recipe of your own. Can you tell me a bit more about that recipe?
When I was doing this, I actually did do 4 blends, and I actually went back to the first one. And which is one of the things they say, you should never change your mind. If you're doing nosing and tasting, and you get them, and then you go back and you change your mind, and especially if you're doing something, if you're doing a sort of what we term as triangle tests, if you're doing certain nose and triangle tests, and more often than not you'll say, oh, I think it's that one. No, I think I'll change it to that one. Then it turns out you're right the first time. So they always say you shouldn't change your mind. And so from my perspective, the timings for me for that, I think it took me about 2 weeks. The time, because you were leaving things for 24 hours and 48 hours, you couldn't really get on to the next part until you'd actually done that. And it was a similar story for John. It took him about 4 weeks, the time he pulled, and that was just to do the blending side. It would have taken a bit longer, because although you're doing the blending, it takes you quite a few weeks to bring the samples in and then move to know the individual things. But his blending side was about 3 or 4 weeks to come up with what he wanted. So in total, we've actually taken about 6 weeks to come up with this, hopefully, perfect blend.
So how would you describe the whisky that you eventually created?
Oh, the whisky I eventually created, it really was reminiscent of a Scotch. You had, initially you got like the sort of citrus notes coming through, and then you got sort of the green floral hedgerow notes coming through, and then eventually, and through time, which was all, you then got a sort of sweetness, but as time went on, you then got the sort of bourbon traits coming through. You then got like the sweetness developed into sort of vanilla fudge, and then you got the sort of oakiness coming through, and then it was very subtle, but then just at the very end, you actually got this hint of blackcurrants coming through. And so to me, you started off as a Scotch, and then you sort of went into all the bourbon flavours that you would expect. But to me, it was reminiscent of a Scotch. From a flavour perspective, it's actually quite interesting, because the bourbon characteristics came through first. You got the sort of vanilla sweetness on the palate, then you got the sort of black currants coming through, and then it was slightly oaky, and then it was just later on you then got this tangy citrus flavour coming through, and then the sweetness then sort of developed into sort of stewed apples rather than the vanilla fudge. When you added a bit of water, it was actually interesting because it did the flip side. Actually, the Scotch flavours came through first, then the bourbon flavours. So it was actually quite a flavour journey, because you were going from one thing to another, and then you sort of did a reverse and came with everything else. So it was really quite interesting.
Well, that's what we like to hear from a whisky. I mean, when we're assessing whiskies for Whisky magazine and the World Whiskies Awards, one of the criteria we look for is the evolution of flavour in a dram. Some people call it the dynamic element of a dram, and I personally, I'm sure you agree, think it's an important part of a whisky drinking experience.
Yes.
Did you find that the language that you and John Rhea used to describe whiskies was very similar, or were there differences there?
I think there was differences, because I had my notes and tasting notes, and they were all towards what Scotch language, what I would use for Scotch and things like that. And reading John's notes, he was more towards probably what they're used to in bourbon. Again, it's because we're in two different spirit types, and it's what we're used to. And I found that he was talking about maybe the rye, the malted barley, coming through and things like that. But he did still use sort of Scotch language. I do use bourbon language, but it's more towards just talking about oaky and woody and things like that. So it's not the sort of raw ingredients that you would get in a bourbon. I tend to sort of more towards the sort of aroma and flavours.
And did you find that, having gone through this process with John over the course of a number of weeks, did you come away and feel like you'd learned something, even after 45 years in the industry?
Yes, we did. Bourbon's something that I didn't know much about, and I just felt I'd learned a lot working with John and just this whole project.
So now, having blended your first Kentucky bourbon, would you find yourself wanting to go back and repeat the experience and perhaps create another one in maybe a different style?
Yes, I think it's something, as I say, it's opened up my mind to bourbon, and I would be interested in working on something else in the future. Although officially I'm retired, but that doesn't mean to say that I can't do something in the future.
And what about getting a taste for bourbon? Do you think you might switch out your regular glass of Scotch whisky for a bourbon in the future?
I think I will, because it's obviously shown that in the past I've not been sort of diverse enough in my options when it comes to bourbon. From a personal point of view, I think I will learn to drink bourbon more socially than what I have done in the past. And I think this experience has shown me that I've not been diverse in my options, and I was really wrong in my preconceptions, and I really did enjoy what I did.